Hello. Thank you for inviting me to speak today at Congreso Futura's important discussion on embracing the future. The topic I was asked to speak about is the doomsday clock and an uncertain future. Next week, the Bulletin will be announcing the 2021 time on the doomsday clock, and I hope this talk provides some backdrop to that announcement, and that the topics discussed at this week's conference held in January helps generate ideas to help us to move back the hands of the doomsday clock progressively away from midnight. That is both my hope and my challenge to you. So let me begin with a bit of history around the clock, where it's been and why it is so close to midnight. So the history of the doomsday clock and why it is set where it is. The clock was commissioned by Manhattan Project scientists in 1947, 2 years after they came together to create the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in Chicago, my organization that now has the shortened name Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. These scientists understood full well that controlling the advancement and proliferation of nuclear weapons was one of the most important challenges they could take up at that moment. These scientists, the same scientists, had unraveled one of the most audacious scientific challenges. They had figured out how to split the atom and to harness the energy that came from it. In other words, the task that they had achieved was equivalent to capturing the power of the sun. That is something of mythical proportions. Nuclear energy, as they understood it, had the power to create enormous good. Its future promised desperately needed cancer treatments. The future held for it the ability to power space travel to Saturn. And beyond, of course, it had the potential to electrify the planet with clean, carbon-free energy. Its promises were enormous. But at the same time, it posed huge dangers. And those dangers were immediately apparent in August of 1945, when 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, respectively. Many of these scientists had been at Los Alamos in the United States or at the University of Chicago to discuss what should be the future of their scientific breakthrough. Even before the bombs were dropped, they understood from their own experience, many of them having been refugees from Europe, that science and politics were inextricably linked, and that for science to flourish, it needed strong institutions and public watchguards to ensure that science flourished within. Within 4 months of dropping the atomic bomb, these scientists began publishing their magazine, The Bulletin, which became essential reading for anyone who wanted to chart the future of atomic politics. In fact, even in those early days, 3 very important lessons were being learned that still resonate today. And those 3 lessons are, first, that scientific advancement always brings opportunities, but always brings considerable dangers. They're different sides of the same coin. Science will not determine which of these 2 is more dominant. Politicians, philosophers, ethicists, and voters will decide how dual-use technologies are managed. We can create norms, rules, laws, and strategies to contain the worst effects of scientific breakthroughs, or we can leave them to be exploited by those with malintentions. Nowhere was this more important than in the realm of nuclear politics, but today new breakthroughs are happening in artificial intelligence, in the realm of cyber, that have the potential to also upend and certainly reshape future societies that require similar attention to what the Manhattan Project scientists were thinking about back in 1945. But a second lesson that they were grappling with at the time and are still with us today is that scientific advancement in the modern era is occurring faster than our ability to control it. That is certainly happening today as we think about the advancements in drone technologies or breakthroughs in genetic engineering, such as in CRISPR and elsewhere, but it was true back then as well. In fact, back in 1945, it was Albert Einstein who said that the release of atomic power has changed everything except our way of thinking. Today, it is no different, and we must use convenings like this one in Chile here today to take stock of the technological landscape and determine the political and ethical challenges that they pose and devise ways to control them so that we may benefit from science's advancement and not suffer from them. And the third lesson I would submit that they were learning back then and still with us now is that scientific advancement is globally experienced, and its risks and benefits are rarely, if ever limited to one country and one country alone. And for that reason, it is all of our responsibilities and requires a global outlook and global action. Back then, it meant beginning to chart political conventions that could control the spread of nuclear weapons. But national leaders worldwide believed they could limit its spread to only their country. How wrong they were. Same today. We've seen it in the ways that leaders have tried to control and respond to the coronavirus. Investing in national resources and national responses, of course, but confronting failing global institutions, underinvesting in those same institutions, and being ill-prepared to invest and work with those global institutions to tackle the current challenges. And we see the results. We see nationalist leaders, the US as a prime example, but not the only one, walking away from international institutions like the WHO, the World Health Organization, rather than investing in them at the time in which they are most needed. And back then, the conversation was about nuclear weapons and what kind of international agreements we needed to control their spread. So turning back to the clock itself, as I promised I would, and the history of it, because what we are talking about now is very relevant to where we are today. So the clock was created in 1947 by artist Martel Langsdorff, who was the wife of a Manhattan Project scientist. It was one of the most powerful examples of the power of what can happen when art and science come together. At that time, those Manhattan Project scientists needed a cover for their bulletin. They were turning it into a magazine, and they needed one as alluring and engaging as Time magazine, Life magazine, and magazines of the day. Martel Langsdorff understood deeply the fears of her husband and his peers. She understood that they believed that time was running out, that citizens needed to pressure their leaders as future civilizations stood directly in harm's way because of an inattention to what that technology could do. She created the clock for the first cover of the first magazine and set it at 7 minutes to midnight, a time that conveyed true urgency, but also conveyed that there was still something to be done, that humans had agency. We could control this if we could create the political laws, rules, norms, and institutions to do so. It has been called the greatest graphic design of the 20th century, both because of its power and its bluntness and simplicity. In 1949, the editor of the Bulletin, Eugene Rabinowitz, moved the clock from 7 minutes to midnight to 5 minutes to midnight when the Soviet Union tested their first atomic bomb, representing another step on the risky path towards civilization's annihilation. And in that move from 7 to 5 minutes, he also took a static graphic representation and made it dynamic. In 1953, he moved it to 3 minutes to midnight, after both the US and the Soviets tested hydrogen bombs. And since then, the clock has been moving towards midnight and away from midnight throughout the years, chronicling how safe or what kind of risk humanity confronts. In 1991, the clock was moved the furthest away it has ever been, it was moved to 17 minutes to midnight. At the end of the Cold War, when new arms control agreements were in the offing, and each side showed a real commitment not only to reducing the stockpiles of their nuclear weapons, but also further containing them and changing their strategies and their postures to make their use less likely. In 2007, the Bulletin took what was probably what was, I believe, its most controversial decision relating to the clock, and that is it added climate change. Up until then, the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin did not have to make a decision about what issues to include to answer two fundamental questions. And those questions, which we ask every year, is humanity safer or at greater risk this year compared to the last year that we set it? And is humanity safer or at greater risk compared to all the time we've been measuring it? And how would we answer that? Up until about 2007, we could answer that by only focusing on nuclear weapons. But by 2007, it was no longer possible to answer that question without adding in climate change, the other existential risk. So in 2007, after about a decade of debate, climate change was added into the doomsday clock in terms of how we set the time. And we see a carelessness around language and a growing threatening language that returns us to nationalistic policies at the exact moment where we need global responses to global challenges. Since 2010, when the Bulletin moved the clock back in response to the signing of the New START nuclear arms agreement between Russia and US, we have steadily moved the clock forward towards midnight, setting it last year at 100 seconds to midnight. So what does that mean for us today? I've already outlined for you some of the lessons for what this means for us today. That scientific advancement always brings risk and benefits, that scientific advancement is moving faster than our ability to control it, and that scientific advancement is by its nature global and requires global responses. But I believe it is why it is so interesting to be having this conversation today in Chile, where you have experienced a very powerful and successful referendum and are engaged in rethinking how to structure your country politically in response to economic dislocation and political frustrations. What makes the experiment so important and yet so risky is that it is one of the few examples where an existing democracy has actively called into question its own constitution and demanded a rethinking of how democracy should look in the 21st century. And you're doing that through a bottom-up approach, putting people first to both craft, but also benefit from these newly designed arrangements. Like so many others, Chile has experienced an aggregation of wealth. It seems that the globalized economy, powered by new technologies, are bringing enormous benefits, but not equally to all, and with considerable harm and risk to many. This is the underbelly or the dark side of globalization. The doubt, skepticism, and questioning of long-standing institutions that in the past provided stability, but today seem ill-equipped to answer society's most pressing problems. As with other democracies around the world, Chile has seen a steady and steep decline in public support for almost every institution in society, including the usual suspects like the National Congress and political parties, but Chileans also express their dislike for the Catholic Church and the police. This is a trend that began 30 years ago in the 1990s, as is true elsewhere around the globe. It is a familiar one to democracies all across the globe, including in my country, the United States. Chile has the opportunity to set an example for states across the globe in developing a 21st century constitution that speaks to many of the changes underway globally. But I believe that we can learn a lot from lessons we've learned in the nuclear space. What will Chile's answer to balancing economic efficiency be with economic justice? How will Chile ensure a healthy respect and investment in scientific advancement, but also that such advancements are bounded ethically and optimally? That is, how will Chile truly live in the world of today with the speed of technological advancement that powers globalization and the waste that it produces that affects our environment every day, but introduce greater equity and justice? How will the new Chilean constitution acknowledge the need for global engagement while at the same time speaking to the needs of its national citizenry? How will Chile engage its neighbors and the evolving global landscape? How can it help make clear that global problems require global solutions? How will that fundamentally important tenet be recognized in your new constitution when it is voted on in 2022? Today, the world faces twin existential threats in nuclear proliferation and climate change. Anything that can be done within the context of the new constitution to curb either one would be a great service to humanity. So in the few minutes I have remaining, what can we do about it? In the US, we must re-engage and sign up to the New START arms control agreement. President Biden will have 16 days upon taking office to re-engage in the last remaining bilateral arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. two of the countries that still maintain 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. In terms of climate change, we must all continue to work towards a greener and more sustainable future. Our children and our children's future depends on it. In terms of disruptive technology, such as artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, we must create panels and oversight committees to ensure that science departments within governments are deeply educated in investment in what is possible and what is new, and ensure that research is supported, but that politicians and citizens have a way to ask hard questions and keep track of recent developments to ensure they don't become used in ways that are unethical. And in Chile, as you write your constitution, I hope that you will consider incorporating all of the above. With your help, we will be able to turn back the hands of the doomsday clock, but there is still much work to be done. Thank you.